We're back. Only on the Channel 5.
The most obvious evidence for the scriptures being allegorical history rather than divine revelation is the phenomena of God trademarked. Each prophet, during or at the end of his series of revelations, state that other men will come along to reveal things about the nature of God, but they will be false prophets, ignorant of true divine revelation. Prophets also identify their audience and their antagonists, with chief adversaries being those who are skeptical about their revelation. Often those who question the nature of these revelations are more despised by God than those who commit rape and murder. The logical inconsistency is telling of what religion is and isn't. The Old Testament identifies monotheism as revealed by Jehovah to a series of descendants. This revelation is exclusively for the Jews and their Holy Land. Christianity, originally self-considered a sect of Judaism, expanded the definition of God's chosen people to all men of the earth, using Jesus' message of ministry for inspiration. This breach in divine intent greatly angered the religious leaders of the Jewish community who believed that God's revelation was purely for his chosen people. Christianity, while often preaching a message of pacifism and ministry, also identified its enemies as those who chose not to believe, those who persecuted Christians, and Satan himself as the demon closing their eyes and sealing their hearts. The Quran revealed by Muhammad can be seen as an Old Testament revival with a universalist goal. The Quran denies the divinity of Christ, calls for ministry and war against disbelieving transgressors, and believes that the world will not be at peace until there is universal belief in the one true God. The hints that these are not factual, divinely inspired works are in the inconsistencies, caveats, and process of revelation, that while these religions hold great truths that should be contemplated, meditated on, and even prayed about, they are also allegorical revelations to prophets who were attempting to improve the life of themselves and their fellow men. After being told not to kill in the desert, the Jews escaping the clutches of Egypt slaughtered the inhabitants of Canaan in holy war ordained by God to grant them the promised land. Some are spared, but entire cities are put to the sword, including women, children, and livestock. While this barbarism must be contextualized within its time in history, it's hard to defend genocide as moral virtue, even if divinely endorsed. Any attempt to logically defend these actions are mental gymnastics on behalf of the advocate. The only consoling fact that we have is that once the Jews conquered the lands of Israel, they stopped. Their divinely ordered genocide was ended by fulfillment of the covenant, and as an insular community, they held on to their monotheism as a revelation exclusively for them. Jesus questioned the nature of Jewish piety and was persecuted and killed for it. Jesus advocated ministering to the poor, the destitute, and the sinner. A chief tenet of Jesus was that divine revelation was not for those who had already heard the revelation of the one God and how to live a just life, but for those who hadn't heard it, or who had ignored it. This emphasis revealed itself in controversial ways, as Jesus emphasized that those outside of the faith could earn God's grace, that justice could be done by the Samaritan, and that God called man to serve his ignorant, wretched neighbor. This call to ministry was expanded to the wider world by Paul, but it was also theologically supported through the life and teachings of Christ. However, this expansion of monotheism came with its own watermark. Followers must believe in the divinity of Christ. Followers must believe in this despite not having the opportunity to see a miracle like doubting Thomas did. Followers must not add on to the books of divine revelation codified by the church hundreds of years after Jesus' death. And this claim to monopoly of the divine is sown the internal inconsistency. Why would God choose to reveal himself through miracles to Iron Age mystics rather than modern scientists? Why would God be able to communicate with human beings through history but not be able to specifically prescribe his revelation in a coherent and universal manner? Why would God pick one nation, on one rock, in one solar system, in the billions of galaxies of the universe for salvation, and condemn the rest to hell for being ignorant of his will? Finally, in the Abrahamic tradition, Muhammad, peace be upon him, an Abrahamic mystic in the Arabian Peninsula and an unlettered man, memorized parts of the Torah and Gospel and began ministering to his people. Muhammad had many challenges and was persecuted for his belief that God Jehovah and his prophets throughout the ages were indeed correct, and that he was the vessel through which the belief in the one true God would conquer the world. Muhammad denied the divinity of Christ and called for a return to the values and revelations of the Old Testament, merely relegating Christ to the role of a great prophet. After persecution, he fled, organized a resistance, built an army, and then conquered the peninsula. Muhammad continued to receive revelations throughout his life and during his battles, and as such, his faith took on a religious militarism where disbelievers who warred against him and his revelations were not just doomed to eternal damnation, but the full weight of his military might. This dark tinge colored his revelations and is used to justify violence in the modern era. The hints at inconsistency are rampant. God is forgiving and merciful in every opening of the Quran, and yet he talks about the fecklessness of disbelievers and their final fate in hell constantly. God preaches restraint, tolerance, and peace, and yet for those who spread corruption and war against the Prophet, their fate in this life is certain, that their heads, hands, and feet should be cut off, or that they be exiled. Those who resist the Prophet and those who follow him can be warred against, and their women taken for slaves. God ordains that female slaves are lawful to their owners for sex, and does not mention their ultimate fates. All of this obvious evil is justified through the disbelief of its victims. It is obvious through the entirety of the text that disbelief is worse than murder and rape. These revelations are coupled with the fact that Muhammad even speaks about whether or not he is making up the Quran. Muhammad states that if he is making up the Quran, then only his sins are on him, and the sins of the listener are upon them. This obvious state of affairs is strange for a divine prophet who believes he is the vessel of God to plant the seed of doubt in his own reader. Coupled with Muhammad's illiteracy, the chronological disorder of the revelation, the violent and inconsistent passages, and the abrupt and unheralded end of the Quran, and the work seems incomplete despite the claim of its adherents. So what can we do with this information? Postmodern nihilists would say ignore everything that was passed down because it was wholly corrupt and should be thrown out root and branch. Many modern people agree, partially because of the reasons I have mentioned earlier, and partially because it's much mentally simpler to do so. Reading the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran, mining for the wisdom and intent, and trying to understand the divine is not only time-consuming, vexing, and difficult, it involves pondering some of the most important existential questions that after 5,000 years of documented civilization, we are no closer to answering. Why were we created and by what force? What constitutes a good life? How do we become strong, just, and wise? How do we commune with the divine, and how do we come to terms with our faults and mortality? Many answers are found in the scriptures of our forebears. The Jews believed that hard work, strength, discipline, loyalty, bravery, cunning, humility, and piety were virtues worth cultivating, and told stories of their ancestors who demonstrated these virtues during times of unimaginable turmoil. Christians believe that ministering to the weak, poor, wretched, evil, and ignorant about the nature of God, the virtues of a good life, and their belief in service to others as the ultimate show of faith. Christian militarism blemished this call, but even within the code of conduct of Christian warriors was etched restraint, compassion, loyalty, and honesty. Muslims use the Prophet's revelations to end infanticide, manage contracts in good faith, care for orphans and widows, free slaves for penance, and reflect on the nature of God, existence, family, charity, and faith. Those that use the verses of the Quran for violence are far outnumbered by those who believe in God, the last day, and do good works, the only three requirements of a believer. I believe that the violence, inconsistency, and claimed monopoly of each faith clearly indicate that no one has an unassailable perspective on the nature of God, life, and existence. I further posit that the prophets were men, looking out into a chaotic and fearful world, who listened to the world around them and then set out to make the world better than when they found it. I claim that we are likewise called to listen to our ancestors, reject what we know to be false, cling to what we know to be true, and ponder the same questions they did. Only by continually doing so and teaching our children to do the same can we make our world and lives better.